Hello, David. I'm Christina Victor, and I'm Professor of Gerontology and Public Health at Brunel University in London. And I'm one of the investigator team for the IDEAL project. I'm not a specialist in dementia. My interest is much more around gerontology. So that's about the study of aging and particularly later life. And I've got a very specific interest in loneliness and isolation. And I know loneliness now is quite a fashionable topic, and the government has a strategy for it. And we see a lot about it in the press, but I got interested in it, I'm afraid to say, more years ago than I care to remember. So one of the things I've been able to do with the team on the IDEAL project is look at how people with dementia and the people who care with them, for them, and live with them often, how do they experience loneliness and isolation as well? And are people lonelier than the rest of the population, or are carers lonelier than the person with dementia? And that's been my kind of major contribution, I think, to the team. So it's of course, my analysis has been of the quantitative data. So looking at percentages of people who say they're lonely, or percentages of people who say they aren't lonely. So it's really nice to be able to have the opportunity to talk to somebody who's been a carer, to get their perspective and perhaps interpretation of the statistics that we've found. Effectively, what the data tell us are that people with dementia have roughly the same level of loneliness as the general adult population. So that's about 5%, but are very much more isolated. So about 20% of people with dementia say they're isolated. Whereas for carers, they were less likely to score highly on the isolation score, but reported really high levels of loneliness. So if the general population and the person with dementia is 5%, then we had just a bit over a third of carers saying they felt severely lonely. So very much higher levels of loneliness amongst the carers than the general population, and very much higher levels of isolation from the people with dementia. And I wondered how, as a carer, and your experiences and your observation of people with dementia, whether that felt real or matched your experiences.
Well, I'm David, and I have my experience briefly is three scenarios. A mother-in-law living in a family situation, going into full-blown Alzheimer's. It's been such a situation in my house and my family that my wife didn't enjoy good health, and I, in fact, did a certain amount of caring for her throughout the latter part of her life. That the social services said, well, we can't have you caring for two people like this. Yeah. Mother-in-law has to go into care. So mother-in-law went out of that. But my experience of Alzheimer's, that was my first experience of Alzheimer's, and how to learn not to say, well, you've told me that before, and all those sort of response type things. Then my late wife, who died in 2012, effectively, she died from diabetes, but in the last 2 years of her life, she was categorized as what then had just been kind of muttered by the psychiatric specialist when he first came to see her. Oh, I think it might be MCI. Had a renewal of the basics because we're into all these issues about forgetting things and so on and so forth, and labels on cupboards, etc., etc. And then sadly, my wife died. She died from diabetes, so the dementia thing was not very much developed, really, but it was an experience. And then finally, and that's what I'm in the middle of now, following the death of my wife, I met another lady who, at the time that I met her, was fine, but she had a TIA. And that gave her a short-term memory loss. which not many people seemed willing to accept. Certainly the family, her family didn't. And so I was both a friend and a carer for her. And now, as that has progressed, family live in the south, clearly taking their responsibility very seriously, wanted her near them so that they could do the caring. But it was kind of, she was just sort of grabbed away from me. So I've experienced that kind of instant loneliness of being on my own again, because there's another serious element in the middle of all this, and that is two years ago, the apartment that I lived in Crewe in Cheshire was burnt to the ground. And so I lost everything. And so I'm living in temporary accommodation now. And there's a very strong isolation factor there because it's a McCarthy and Stone block of apartments. And I came in part of the way through the lockdown. So, and there's very little social space compared with what there was at the previous place. And so you hardly ever see anybody. You have to make your own social life outside. And I've done that. I'm in a position to do that because I've lived in this area for 50 years. Now, I've talked to you particularly about the situation at the moment because this lady has been having a fairly terrible time, as you might imagine, because here she is with short-term memory loss. She's grabbed out of a situation with which she's familiar, where she's lived for 15 years or whatever. So she had a group of friends. I come along, and then I'm almost her constant companion. So that's brilliant for both of us. But now that she's taken away with this becoming more serious memory loss, put in a McCarthy and Stone in Hampshire.
Yeah.
She doesn't know where she is. Chances for meeting people in the lockdown were very small. She's afraid to go out because she doesn't know, she can't be clear about whether she understands the geography, whether she can get back, and so on. However, I maintain touch with her by telephone, bit of encouragement, bit of understanding of what she's going through, trying to interpret it for her, although of course her short-term memory is such that she won't remember it much beyond the end of the telephone call. So I've got two lots of isolation in that sense. I've had that very personal isolation, but I've got the physical isolation of where I am, the geography of the place that I live in. I can't identify with the statistics too much because, as I said, I've lived in the area for 50 years, so I've got a lot of friends. I've got a lot of interests as a retired academic. Alzheimer's Society, Age UK, I'm in the Rotary Club, etc., etc. So all of these drive the isolation away, if you like, in a way. And yet, when you shut the door,
yes, you're alone.
You're alone. You're isolated.
I mean, a lot of what you say resonates with the kind of research and our understanding of these things, and one of which is the importance of the place where we live. Because if you've lived in an area for a long time, you're familiar with the geography. So you go out, you may only go to where I live, there's a village shop. You may only go up to the village shop, but when on the way there, you see people, even if you don't have a big chat with them. I think there's a lot of evidence that these sort of micro interactions, saying good morning to people on the way, and saying hello to the postie when he delivers your mail, are quite important for maintaining people's sense of self and well-being. And if you take your friend who's been uprooted, and the family has done that for all good reasons and relocated somebody in a place they're not familiar with, well, it isn't surprising that she doesn't want to go out, and then you become quite detached from the community other than your family or anybody who phones up. And I think the point you make about housing is really important. So I'm stunned that a lot of specialist providers for senior citizens, the kinds of the kinds of buildings they construct don't promote sort of social engagement. There are no, there often aren't very good social spaces, or they're not very nice, or not well thought out in terms of how to promote people meeting. I know in the building I work in on campus, the place you meet people is going up and down the stairs.
Yeah, likewise on the corridor here,
yeah,
you're going along the corridor either out or in, and you see people. But
I was just thinking, you said your mother-in-law went into it, so she lived with, presumably, did she live with you? Yeah,
she did.
And then she went into a care home, and I mean that's one. Imagine that's quite a big dislocation to your social connections if you are you move from your family into a care environment where everything's much more regulated, and we don't know a lot about loneliness in care homes, but one might speculate that it could be quite high if you're not surrounded by your familiar environment and by your familiar things, because I think often the kinds of things we have around us as well can support our sense of not being lonely. I never quite know what the opposite is, but if
thinking about it in preparation for this, I thought, well, actually, what happened to my recent lady friend is akin to going into a care home, isn't it? Just to speak briefly about my own personal feelings, I find that I feel very lonely in patches, which is fairly normal, I guess. But my life has been, in many senses, a life of service. I mean, I was a teacher, if you can count, that's a kind of service, I suppose. But I've been involved in the Samaritans and the Alzheimer's Society, of course, and Age UK, all these sort of things, and the church. And I've sort of always to kind of put myself into that. I even do the Alzheimer's. They have a companion, what they call a companion call system. I've got 4 people on there, so it is about a bit about your personal drive, isn't it, in terms of what you want to do, what you feel you can do, and what you're able to do. I mean, there are very substantial limitations sometimes in what you can do. But the worst thing of all, and I'm sure you probably all experienced this, is when you shut the door at night, when you've turned the telly off, it is time to go to bed. Absolute silence. Absolute.
I mean, one of the things that interests me from an academic point of view, and referring to what you say, and where I have a bit of an argument with things like the campaign to end loneliness, I think all of us experience loneliness at particular times. Most of us feel lonely at some point in our lives, different points in our lives, but for most of us, it's just it's part of being human in a way. You get the highs and you get the lows, and I think one of my big soapboxes is that we make it seem an unnatural experience, and we're pathologizing it. We're making it something that it isn't. I think for some people it is very severe and very debilitating, but for most people it's I think part and parcel of living, and it's something we all experience and deal with. So maybe I'll go back to where I started and conclude by kind of getting your views about our data shows that people with dementia don't particularly feel lonely, but they do feel isolated, whereas carers, the problem or the biggest issue, it seems to be around loneliness, but they don't feel themselves to be isolated. And I just wonder whether that resonated. Now, it may be academic splitting hairs about isolation, which is about sort of contacts. rather than loneliness, which is how you feel about your contacts. Maybe it doesn't matter, but I just wondered if you had a perspective on that distinction.
I think I go back to something that I said in another interview, and that was about how every case is slightly different. So I'm always slightly worried about the generalizations.
Yeah. So I think the carers and you know, potentially, if you're caring, you may have your adult children coming in to help. There may be some volunteers. You might have a phone call. So there are people in touch, but you're caring for in most cases, your spouse, who is your life partner, and the loneliness derives from perhaps the lack of being able to have a meaningful relationship with the person that you loved and built a life with. Whereas for the person with dementia, perhaps the fact that you're still there is enough, but they miss but they're very aware of perhaps not seeing their own friends, or their, you know, in my case, the swimming group that they used to go to. But I have nothing other than a hunch, and perhaps watching my mother look after my father, who had vascular dementia. But
well, all I would say is, if, as the ideal project seeks to do, to provide support materials of various kinds, I think all I could say with any conviction was, well, okay, we want to help you, and we're going to do our best that we can, but we can do that best by, rather than facts and figures too much, by giving 5 or 6 scenarios, you know, in a video or something of that sort, to encourage people, because, as I say, the situations are so variable.
There is guidance and support around for people, but sometimes it's hard to take the first step. I think the one good thing that has come out of the renewed interest in loneliness is now that we don't just see it as a problem of old age. When I first started in research, it was almost seen as being part of normal aging, in the same way that arthritis or, you know, dementia might have been. It was, well, you know, what do you expect when you get old? You know, you're going to be lonely, you're going to be limited of it. So now we understand that it's an experience that affects people across the lifespans. And it's not seen as being a stereotype about older people. It's something that everybody experiences. So I think that's helpful.
When I was looking after my late wife, which is the most strictly the caring role, is as precise there as it can be. When my wife died, of course, and everybody who has goes through a death in a relationship like that, you know, it just stops, and you have to come to terms with all the feelings and things that go with that, because it's just abrupt, and that's it. You know, a counter thing to that, of course, is that there are 8 grandchildren